Motivational interviewing, or MI, is a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication that pays extremely close attention to the language of change. It is designed specifically to strengthen a person's own internal commitment. To do this, the counselor explores the client's reasons for changing within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. The practice was developed in the addiction field by clinical psychologists William Miller and Stephen Rolnick. They observed that traditional confrontational approaches usually backfired. Forcing an argument for change reliably increased client resistance and worsened outcomes. Today, MI is one of the most rigorously researched approaches in substance use treatment. It operates both as an effective standalone brief intervention and as a foundation to prepare clients for further therapy. The methodology removes the adversarial dynamic of forcing a patient to comply. Instead, it relies on a highly respectful partnership where the counselor helps clients literally talk themselves into change. To understand how this works, we have to look at the assumptions separating MI from standard advice giving. The first is that ambivalence is normal. Most people considering a change feel two ways about it at once. Getting stuck in that ambivalence is the ordinary condition of someone with a substance use problem. It is not a sign of pathology. Second, motivation is not a fixed personality trait. It is a highly malleable state that fluctuates, and it can be directly influenced by the conversation at hand. The third and most central assumption relies on human psychology. People are more persuaded by what they hear themselves say than by what they are told by someone else. When a counselor supplies external arguments for why a client should stop an addictive behavior, it almost always provokes the client into defending the status quo. Therefore, the counselor's primary job is to reverse that dynamic. The goal is to evoke the client's own arguments for change. The final assumption is that the responsibility and the actual capacity for change reside entirely within the client. Effective therapy requires the counselor to step into the role of a knowledgeable companion. They must surrender the urge to dictate outcomes and instead empower the client's internal capacity to heal. Motivational interviewing relies on a specific underlying stance known as the spirit of MI. Without this framework, the clinical techniques devolve into manipulation and ultimately fail. This spirit is built on 4 pillars, starting with partnership. MI is done with and for the client. The client's expertise regarding their own life is honored exactly as much as the counselor's clinical expertise about change. Next is acceptance. The counselor conveys absolute worth, accurate empathy, and explicit support for the client's autonomy. Clinically, acceptance does not mean approving of a destructive behavior. It means prizing the person and respecting their absolute right to choose their own path. The third pillar is compassion. The counselor actively promotes the client's welfare and prioritizes their needs. This clinical sincerity separates MI from sales or persuasion tactics that might share surface-level similarities. The final pillar is evocation. This is the practice of drawing out the motivations, values, and resources the client already holds. The counselor's role is the extraction of existing resources, not the installation of new ones. The process operates on the premise that the client already possesses what is necessary for change. The largest obstacle to maintaining this stance is a cognitive habit known as the righting reflex. This is the helper's natural urge to set things right, to immediately fix the problem, and to persuade the client of the obvious need to change their behavior. When a clinician leans into this urge, they trigger a psychological backlash. When human beings are pushed aggressively toward one position, they tend to defend the exact opposite. When a counselor argues for change, an ambivalent client will predictably voice the reasons not to change. Hearing themselves argue against the counselor's push causes them to become further entrenched in their current behavior. To succeed, an MI counselor must deliberately step back. When you notice yourself slipping into persuading, lecturing, or warning, then you have to resist the reflex. This provides a definitive internal rule for clinicians. If you find yourself working harder than the client, your strategy has failed, and you must change your approach. Once the underlying stance is established, MI is executed through 4 foundational microskills, remembered by the acronym OARS. The O stands for open questions. These invite elaboration and exploration, and MI requires a high ratio of open questions to closed ones. Asking, "What concerns you about your drinking?" opens a detailed conversation. Asking, "Do you think you drink too much?" invites a defensive yes or no, effectively closing the dialogue. The A is for affirmations. These specifically and genuinely recognize the client's strengths and efforts. This builds the working alliance and directly counters the demoralization so common in addiction. The R stands for reflections. These are statements that mirror back the client's meaning, and they act as the primary engine of the MI process. Simple reflections directly restate or rephrase what was just said. Complex reflections go further, capturing the underlying feeling or meaning beneath the words, effectively continuing the paragraph the client started. Finally, the S represents summaries. These are used to gather what the client has said into a coherent whole, communicate that they have been accurately heard, and selectively reinforce key themes. Mastering these 4 techniques allows the counselor to navigate the conversation efficiently and crystallize the client's own motivation at critical transition points. The precise execution of OARS is directed at a single target, the client's language. MI categorizes client speech into 2 types. Sustained talk favors the status quo, like saying, "I don't really have a problem." Change talk is any speech that favors movement toward a new behavior. Research shows the more change talk a client voices, the more likely behavior change becomes. This begins with preparatory statements of desire, ability, reasons, or need. This builds into mobilizing change talk, signaling readiness, commitment, activation, or steps taken. The counselor's ultimate task is to constantly scan for this change talk, evoke more of it through open questions, and reinforce it through reflections and summaries, all while carefully avoiding the amplification of sustained talk. This structured methodology relies entirely on the client's own truth. It is the disciplined facilitation of helping a client hear, build on, and finally act upon their own genuine motivations.